about my background. Give me a second to navigate this, and I will be right with you. So, I worked for the National Park Service at Sandy Hook, New Jersey. Sandy Hook is home to the oldest lighthouse in the United States, and it is where it sits in Lower New York Harbor. Was the reason for the lighthouse is that any ship entering New York City had to go through the Sandy Hook Channel. So that's every merchant ship, and then later on warships had to come in that way. So Sandy Hook was important first to the maritime interest and then to the military interests of the country, which is the big themes. If you go visit there today, it's a 6 mile long beach, but there's a lot of history that's involved with that. So here I am about 30 years ago as a park ranger. The Fort Hancock was created in 1895 and it served until 1974. So what's on the top were the fortifications. That was Battery Potter. Battery Potter was the oldest disappearing gun battery in the United States. The guns that were in that lifted up onto the roof, shot their projectile out at the potential battleship enemy. I'm talking about Spanish-American wartime period, and then came back down behind a wall, and all you could see was earth and sand, so it evidently disappeared from view. At the bottom is the Nike Hercules and Ajax missiles. They were at Fort Hancock from 1954 to 1974. And so in 1974, when the SALT Treaty was signed between the US and the Soviet Union, the surface-to-air missiles went away and allowed for Sandy Hook to become a national park. The oldest life-saving station in the United States was built on Sandy Hook. It was the first one with federal funds. That original building is now at the Lighthouse of Twin Lights on the Highlands, about 6 miles away in a state park. But the third station that was built at Spermaceti Cove on Sandy Hook still stands, and it's just recently been restored. When I was working there, it was our park visitor center, so I spent 7 years in this building. And then the last 9, I was museum curator. And as a museum curator, I had about 30,000 artifacts that I was in charge of, everything from artillery shells, like you can see in this picture that I'm holding, to seashells. We had uniforms, we had letters, we had all sorts of different wonderful resources, archaeology, things from the lighthouse, just wonderful artifacts were part of the collection of Sandy Hook. So one of the last things I did as museum curator in 2003, I believe it was, we started an oral history program with students from Monmouth University. So the students and I did a number of interviews, and then when the students left, I finished the interviews. So we did about 80 of them recorded in a 3-year time period. And they are available on the park's website. And what I did is after we moved to Maryland with my husband's job with the Army, and I created my own business, which is called Beacon Point History Services. And I have a Facebook page and a YouTube channel that talks about the different programs that I offer. So I do 2 on women's history, and I do a number on other things as well. But we are going to go into the program now. Just give me a second. Okay, so the skirt and stocking clad soldier went in the military in World War II. So before World War II, there was an Army Nurse Corps, and the Army Nurse Corps was 1901, and the Navy Nurse Corps is 1908. So the women serving in those functions, Clara Barton was with the Civil War, but she wasn't an official part of the Army. She was nursing, but not officially. But they realized that they needed to do something because Spanish American War came after that, and women were needed as nurses. Men couldn't do it all. So they started the different nurse corps, but they were serving with the Army and the Navy, but they were not officially members. They still had a uniform, but they were not seen as members. It wasn't until 1920 that the Army gave the nurses relative rank, which is basically they were mostly almost all second lieutenants. And that continued all through World War II, where you might have had a captain who was in charge, but they were not given the same full pay and benefits until after World War II. So during World War One, this was a really interesting part of history that I didn't know about until relatively recently. There was something called the Hello Girls, and there's a PBS special about this that I recently saw as well. But the Hello Girls were in the U.S. Army Signal Corps. 223 Americans who were fluent in French and English went to France and were maintaining the phone lines. So they needed men were not very good at switchboards. Women ran the switchboards since there were telephones. So they actively recruited either native French speakers or women who had gone to college for French, and they sent them overseas. They were given uniforms, they were housed, they were told that they were part of the military, but after the war, they said, oh, you weren't really in the military. So they did not get the benefits of being a veteran. So World War II comes around, and you have Army and Navy nurses, and they're serving. The war starts, and you have women who were serving all over the place, including on the Philippines. And soon after Pearl Harbor, the Philippines was taken over by the Japanese, and the hospital that was there was as well taken over. And there were 66 Army nurses and 11 Navy nurses who were held as POWs for was a really long time, almost a 4-year period, until they were finally freed. So the whole Army Nurse Corps had 59,000 women serving during World War II, and more than half of them served overseas. And the Navy was much smaller, but they still had 14,000 women serving. This is a wonderful movie in case you've never seen it. So Proudly We Hail with Claude Colbert. It explains everything that went on as these women were so heroic during their time serving as POWs. They were still taking care of their patients during that time. So back in the U.S., I have a couple images. So Fort Hancock is where I work. So I got a photograph of the staff hospital. There were men and women serving together there in the nurses. And Aberdeen Proving Ground, which is where my husband works, is an image of them getting gas mask instruction, because it wasn't just those going overseas that were issued gas masks. They were issued them stateside because they did not know what was going to happen. So in all Army bases, our Navy bases, everything on the U.S. side, gas mask drills were part of the routine. So now they decide they need to do a little bit more. So they have Army and Navy nurses. That's great, but we are in a total war. In the United States, they looked to England, and what did they see? They saw the whole country getting bombed, and they took women and they made them part of a force. So this was something that they had to do. General George Marshall is the Army Chief of Staff. December, the war starts. There are innumerable duties being done by soldiers that can actually be done better by women, such as the switchboard operators. But there's so many other things that they could do that he asked Congress to see if they could pass something and make it part of the Army. So we have the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps. So it was an auxiliary, not part of the Army. Women were auxiliary members, which means they weren't given the same ranks and privileges as men. A private was an auxiliary. They had different, very bizarre names and leaders and different ranks. They weren't private, corporal, and sergeant. They had different ranks. They were a separate corps but the women would be when allowed to go overseas. So the first bill that was passed was May 15th, 1942. And there was a lot of protest about this. Ministers, parents didn't want their women serving alongside men. There were moral issues, all sorts of different reasons why they didn't want women to join the army. So I'm going to show a short video.
Although ladies rarely celebrate birthdays, these young ladies are justly proud on May 14th, 1943, the first anniversary of the founding of the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps. It hasn't been an easy year for the woman soldier. Despite efficient accomplishment of her duties, sideline quarterbacks have taken pot shots at her from every angle. At Army posts and camps throughout the United States, she's taken up not only the clerical or stenographic sort of duties she might have had in civilian life, but also she's been given new kinds of jobs requiring newly acquired skills. As a dispatcher for the Air Corps, a motor pool mechanic, a radio operator, efficiently handling the new and complicated GI equipment. She's freeing fighting men for the job of getting the war over with in a hurry. Now that the WAC enrollment quota has jumped from 25 to 150,000, and they're appearing all over in increasing numbers, a lot of guys have an honest curiosity. Forget the idle chatter. On the level, what is this WAC outfit? Every WAC is a volunteer. She enlists because she wants to. She's going in of her own free will to help win the war quickly. She's between 21 and 45 and must be an American citizen. First off, she gets a mental alertness test, and then an interview with an officer who determines her suitability for the Corps. Then, if she passes her physical, she's sworn in and sent to one of the 5 basic training centers where she undergoes 4 weeks of tough basic training. The complete GI routine from typhoid and tetanus shots through military courtesy right down to KP. All of it except for the manual of arms. Both physically and mentally, the training is strict and comprehensive. And whether it's chemical warfare drill or Red Cross life-saving practice, he's got a lot to learn and do in 1 month. Each company assigned to a post is self-sufficient with its own administrative officers, its own PX, its own mess with whack cooks, and its own fatigue details. Here again, it's apparent that the WAC is determined to prove she's primarily a soldier, asking no special consideration or attention. Why not? Well, for one thing, most of the WACs have a brother or a boyfriend or a husband somewhere in the service. Like this auxiliary whose son is in ODs overseas. Yes, it's their war too. And as the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps begins its second year of even greater and more expanded activity, America has reason to salute its women soldiers. All part of the same army. All working to win the same war.
Okay, so I love that video because it really does explain everything about the service. So back to its creation, we have director Obeda Cope Hobby. She was the publisher of the Houston Post. And then after the war, she was the first Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare. So she was considered a colonel. They didn't let her be a general, but she was the highest ranking officer, and she was a colonel. So when she first took over, she came up and she said, you have to make the change from peacetime pursuits to wartime tasks, from individualism of civilian life to the anonymity of mass military life. You have given up the comforts of home, highly paid positions, leisure. You have taken off silk and put on khaki, and all for essentially the same reason. You have a debt and a date, a debt to democracy and a date with destiny. So that was the first graduating class, and that was at Fort Des Moines in Iowa. Women in uniform, they first wanted to fill out the officer slots, which were 450, and 13,000 women applied. There were many, many women who had master's degrees that were applying because they felt that this was a way to get ahead. They might have been working in whatever corporate structure they were, but to join the military, they thought that that would advance their careers even further. They had to be between 21 and 50. They had to have a high school diploma, which the men did not. They had to be between 5 and 6 feet tall and between 105 and 200 pounds. So time went by, and the other services created their women's services, such as the Waves, which was the Navy, and they made them part of the official reserves, not an auxiliary. So the Women's Army Corps, because it was the first, realized a number of mistakes right away. So they had to eventually, by the following September, they converted it to the Women's Army Corps, no more an auxiliary. They got the same ranks and benefits as the men, so they were now privates, corporals, sergeants, and a few officers. At the peak of service, there were 99,000 serving at any one point in time, and total wartime, 149,000 women wore the uniform. So there was a little bit of confusion when they changed from being auxiliary to being wax, because when they were auxiliary, they weren't really in the military, but they had to come out and again make sure that they had to get their physicals done, and they had to pass the physical, of course. And they changed the standards slightly when it became part of the regular army. They allowed them to be a couple inches shorter, 58 inches, and they could be 100 pounds instead of 105 pounds. And then make sure that they could correct their vision to 2040 as well. So this is at Fort Hancock. This is in front of the barracks that the women served at work, lived in. And they are taking the oath of allegiance in September of 1943. Now, you can notice a couple things about this image is that the skirts all look very uncomfortable, and they're all the same height, because it was the requirement was no matter how short or tall the woman was, that her hemline was 16 inches from the ground, so that when they marched in unison. The other thing is, as well, is stockings were rationed. Silk stockings were rationed for everybody because they were what they made parachutes out of. So a lot of times they might have been given one issue of silk to wear on special occasions, or they were given cotton. And a lot of women resorted to using an eyebrow pencil down the back of their legs, because these stockings used to have seams down the back of the legs. So we have the Waves. So the Waves came in, they learned from all the mistakes of the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, which was called the WACs. They were given not so pleasant nicknames like the Wacky Wax. So the Navy said, let's come up with a good acronym first, and then we'll pick out, they'll call them the Waves. That sounds really neat. We'll pick out the words after we come up with the nice letters. So it became the Women Accepted for Volunteer Emergency Service. This is only 2 months later, in July of 1942, and they were immediately given the same ranks and privileges as the men. So there was no problems there. Mildred Horton was the director, and she came from academia, so she chose to use college campuses as locations for the training. And in total, 80,000 women have served in the Waves. So she was a president of Wesley College, and the largest facility was at Hunter College, and they also used Wesley and Smith for the officers. So Nancy Lynn Castellano was assigned as a supervisor of personnel at the Hunter College. She also taught things, and she said, we didn't do anything heroic. All these women came from across the country to New York, and they were thrilled to be in the Navy. The Marines, which are part of the Navy, were created on the same day, July 30th, 1942, and their director brought them to Camp Lejeune, and they wanted them to see combat training. There were 18,000 women Marines, so they were a little bit different. They actually observed combat training where the WACs and the Waves did not. And we have an image of the Women Marine Marching Band. The smallest of the service were the spars, and they used their Latin name um, of the Coast Guard to come up with their cool nickname. And that was not until November 23rd, 1942, and there were 11,000 who served in the Coast Guard Reserve. Now, those were the main services. Then there were the WASPs, and the WASPs were highly skilled. They all had to be certified pilots before they joined. So 1,074 women served in this outfit. They were not considered part of the military. They did not get military status until Congress finally passed something in 1977. And 38 women died during their duties. This was They were ferrying planes that were brand new, and a lot of men didn't want to do this job because it was so dangerous. They did not, these were not tested planes. They were flying them from base to base stateside. 38 women died during this time period, and because they were not members of the military, their families had to pay for their arrangements to be sent home. Jackie Cochran was the leader of the WASPs, and this is just what woman who discussed this with her said. She was called me in her apartment. She showed me a copy of a letter from the War Department. It said, "We have to give these women a chance to fly. We do not think they will ever be able to fly military airplanes. Get rid of them as soon as possible." So the men didn't win on this one. The women were very successful, and they flew all these planes all over the country. So there were two different parts that became part of the WASPs. There was the WAFs, which was a ferrying service, and these women are at Newcastle Army Air Base in Delaware, and they were the ferrying ones. So they would bring them from point A to point B. The WASPs were but what happened was the two services came into one, and they all became part of the WASPs. So what type of work did women do throughout all the services? Clerical, they drove trucks, they were in the motor pool, they were mechanics, they were mathematicians, they test fired guns here at Aberdeen Proving Ground near where I live. They test fired many guns there. In the Navy especially, and in the Air Force, which was part of the Army at the time, they were doing air traffic control. And here is a little video.
At an Army Air Force base in Arizona, women mechanics learn to service the big bombers, receive expert instruction in every phase of aircraft maintenance. A plane named in their honor gets a thorough going over by the air whacks, as they're called. From motor to tail assembly, the girls make ready the giant battleships of the air. 65,000 strong, they relieve men for combat duty. Today, the WACs are serving with the armed forces in every major theater of war. The first contingent to arrive in Australia gets a real welcome. Reporting for duty half a world away from home, these United States Army women are making a vital contribution to the cause of the United Nations.
And we're back with March Sadness. And the team is looking down the barrel of a 4:55 meeting.
Excuse me for a second. We just had a little...
They're gassed, Jill. Can they turn it around and make this meeting an email?
It's going to be a tough shot. But whoa there. They're getting an assist from Grammarly. Jones is taking the ball and running with it. She's asking Grammarly to write the first draft of an email.
What a play. Grammarly is an AI writing partner that helps you make your point.
Sorry about that. Okay. Okay, so I just want to point out there was a little bit of resentment. This is the Fort Hancock newspaper at the time. The men were not getting the promotions as quickly as the women were because there were so few of the women. They had to promote them quickly. So in this particular instance, 21 WACs received stripes. So all of a sudden, these these women who just joined were becoming corporals and becoming sergeants, and the men who had been there for a very long time were not getting promoted as quickly. So there's something called column left, and it was sort of like a tongue-in-cheek thing, saying it's Fort Hancock's widely known sleeve disease, saying they had uh, a lack of ranks, but all of a sudden, it says several carloads of the stripes were going to the WAC barracks, which was off limits. So that, there was a little bit of here and there of resentment, but it wasn't terribly bad. So there were African American women also served in all of the services. In the WACs, there were 6,500 African American women that served, and the biggest unit that went overseas was the Central Postal Directory Battalion, where 855 Black service women served. There was also an all Black female band in the service as well. Then there were the Rosie the Riveters, which would be civilian workers working on ordnance. And there's an entire national park in California called Rosie the Riveter on the Homefront National Park, which was at a shipbuilding location. And this is a little video about them.
Man utilized, we are still short millions of hands. We must call upon women. All over the United States, women are called upon to leave their homes and take jobs. Among our young unmarried women and among older women whose children are grown, we have a large reserve. They discover that factory work is usually no more difficult than housework. Employers find that women can do many jobs as well as men, some jobs better. Tens of thousands of women are already at work in aircraft. More are being added as fast as they apply. This solves the breadwinning problem for many families whose men are at war. The government's policy is that women should get the same pay that men get for similar work. Where necessary, machinery is adapted for women's use. When a hand drill weighs heavily on feminine muscles, the lazy arm drill is introduced to take off the strain.
So I just wanted to point that out as well. So if your husband was serving, the pay for a private was $21 a month. So a woman was generally going to get paid a lot better if she was working in a factory, and that would really help out with the family. So I like to point out some things, and so in Philadelphia Naval Yard, 1944, there were 47,000 full-time civilian employees working at the time. There were African Americans as well as men and women. Everybody was working at the factory there, and they were all building the ships for the common good. So I just like to point out some local things for you. And the other one is the Bud Manufacturing Company, which was in North Philly. The woman on the left is making bombs. They had just made their 100,000th bomb. And on the right, there's WACs who are looking at an aircraft that was made out of stainless steel. So that manufacturing plant also made train cars, but during the war, they did all sorts of things with stainless steel. And so these women who were working were union members. This membership card is from the New Castle County Airport in Delaware here at the Belenka Air Company. And I don't know if you've ever seen this movie, but it's a wonderful movie called It Was a Male War Bride with Cary Grant and Ann Sheridan. And it talks about being in the military as a woman, and he was a French soldier. So they were getting married and he was coming back as a dependent of a woman. So it was very complicated, but it's a comedy. It's a good movie. So I wanted to point out a couple of women who were war workers. This is Bertha Tooting. Bertha's husband served at Fort Hancock, and he worked on some of the 12-inch guns that were out there. And she was in this ad in the newspaper saying, "I'm thankful to be working on Thanksgiving." She worked in the radio tube division for RCA. And she came out and did an interview. I just want to show this is the day that she came to do her interview, and that was her husband, Bill, at the gun battery. And what she was saying about this ad was, "I was thankful to be working on Thanksgiving." She said it was taken in 1942, and Thanksgiving we worked. And we also went to work on Sundays. And we had moved to New Jersey in 1941, and within 3 days I started working for RCA, and I was there for well over 22 years. I had my son. I went back to work for another 6.5 years, but this was taken during the war. I worked on radio tubes, and of course I did secret work for the Army too. And she said, "I'm not going to say anything about that." But her son said, "I don't think it's secret anymore." So then she talked a little bit about it. She said that she worked on submarine tubes. She said it was really interesting work and she really enjoyed it. And she started talking about how she ended up meeting her husband. So this was up in North Jersey. They had buses and they were asked any of the women if they'd like to go to Fort Hancock and dance with the servicemen. And of course, it was well chaperoned. We were not allowed off outside the dance hall, just on the porch. And I was there and my husband was stationed there. And the first night he came off duty, he came to the dance and we happened to meet. And from then on, we started to date. We got married on the 21st of April, 1945. So a group of us would come down by bus, and we made 3 or 4 trips down. She was a very sweet lady. So when the women arrived at Fort Hancock, there were only 9 in the first contingent, and by the end of the war, they were in the barracks that was meant for 109 men. There were about 60 women who served at Fort Hancock. And these are some of the wonderful images. There was a post photographer at Fort Hancock who, after the war, he said, "What should I do with the photographs?" And they said, "Throw them out." He kept them, and then he gave them to the park a number of years later. But they're just such wonderful images. You can see women doing stenography, driving trucks, doing all sorts of things. So this one young lady was a dental assistant, and the photo journalist, actually his job was to follow her around all day, and it was called A Day in the Life of a Whack. And so we could watch her working, and then show them playing ping pong and doing other activities, and going into their barracks. And at the end of the night they showed a picture of them going on a date, and there was a big sign outside the women's barracks that said "Off Limits." So the man had to stand outside, and they greeted each other, and she went home to her barracks. And you can see some images from the barracks here as well. The women in their barracks buildings were given shades. Of course they did at Fort Hancock, because they had to have blackout curtains, because we had to make sure that they weren't seen. The U-boats couldn't see ships in the harbor, so they had blackout curtains. Women had bathtubs in the barracks. They also had sheets. Men were not issued these things. They just had a scratchy wool blanket and showers. So they had a few more creature comforts. There were less people in the building because they were using a barracks. The barracks had to be 150 feet away from a men's barracks or have an intervening structure. And at Fort Hancock, there was not enough room, so the barracks next to it became a headquarters during the war. So that they could have the women were kind of separated from the men. So here we go. Here's the image of the wax barracks being off limit and at the end of their day. And of course you have your whack and soldier wedding happening. And I'm not sure that would be the attire I would want to wear for my wedding, but she got dressed in her uniform for her wedding. This is Mary Duff Heckendorf, and she did an interview with us on the telephone. And her in the picture at the orientation board, she was the post librarian. She's on the left standing up at the orientation board. She was a librarian prior to the war, and she served at the Fort Hancock Library while in the time that she was there. She was also the author of the column Left, which was the tongue-in-cheek articles that they would write something funny about what was going on during the war. And this is Loretta Hoffman. On my Beacon Point History Services YouTube channel, you can watch a 20-minute long interview with her. She decided at 21 that she wanted to leave her office job and she wanted to serve. She was living in Brooklyn and she would take the subway every day to Manhattan to go to work. And she said, I want to serve. If I was a man, I would have served. And she told her father after she signed up, she was a little afraid that he was going to say no. But once she told him, he was proud of her. She was happy. Uh, they were both very happy about this, and she came down and served at Fort Hancock for a while. In the evening, she worked in post headquarters, and I asked her if she wore silk stockings. She said, absolutely. I worked in post headquarters. You had to wear silk there. And in the evening, she got an extra job working in the Post Theater. And that's an image of her taking some tickets. The gentleman in the picture there was her husband, and she met him. He was the post projectionist. During the war, he stayed there the entire war because every time his unit shipped out, the commanding officer changed his assignment because it was more important to have a good projectionist at the movie theater than it was to have another soldier go overseas. So she got to meet him. She was sent to the Pentagon, and then after the war, they were married. And she went to school on the GI Bill and became a teacher for the rest of her career. Uh, Now, these two ladies were civilian employees at Fort Hancock. They were recruited out of high school to work on, they were artists, and they were asked to work on some drafting. So they were sent out to Fort Hancock, and they were working on a project that became what is today known as radar. They did not know what they were working on. They were told to draw certain things, but it was highly secretive operations going on the beaches at Fort Hancock, where they were developing the radar that eventually detected the airplanes that were going into Pearl Harbor, although it was still experimental in Hawaii at the time, and they didn't know what they were viewing. So there were two radar systems developed on the beach at Sandy Hook, and so they were instrumental in doing drawings for this. This is Fort Monmouth, which is another base, and their newspaper showed different views of the latest in women's headgear in the WAC. It's sort of a funny little thing. And it was also talking about two sisters that got reunited. They were at the two close by army posts, and they finally got to see each other again. Now, another part of this was the women all in the army. I know mostly about the army because that was what was at Fort Hancock, and I was a reenactor there and did programs as the Women's Army Corps. But in the other services, they wore the insignia of the group that they were assigned to. With the Women's Army Corps, they wore the Athena symbol of the WAC. They didn't want women to be wearing crossed rifles of infantry or crossed cannons of artillery. But during the war, you can see here the Signal Corps did change that. They changed it in 1943 to let the women wear the Signal Corps insignia. I guess because it was non-combat, it was a little bit more tolerated, but they were able to finally wear the Signal Corps insignia. So after World War II, all the units were disbanded right after the war, all of the women's services. But in 1948, there was an act of Congress, the Women's Armed Services Integration Act, and they were made a permanent reserve part of the military. In 1978, the Army abolished the WAC, and all the services made women and men into regular units of the military. So there was no more waves, there were no more WACs. And in 1978, Navy women were allowed to serve on non-combatant ships. So if you are interested, I have this online article about the women of Fort Hancock. It's Garden State Legacy magazine, and it talks about all the things that the women did in their service. So I would be glad to answer anyone's questions. If you want, this is a picture of the post chapel at Fort Hancock. That building was built um, all over the United States. It was a 700 series building. There were barracks. Everything was built that looked of that. They were all made out of wood. They were all supposed to last 15 years. And that was a very typical chapel that was built at the time. If anybody has any questions, I'd be glad to answer them. I really enjoyed doing the research on this. The other women's program that I talk about are women lighthouse keepers, which is a totally other um, it's a whole very interesting story of women lighthouse keepers and how they were one of the first federal employees that were women other than clerks.
Well, I would definitely love to have you back to talk about that. Um, so I think you touched on it a little bit with one of my questions I have is like, how exactly do you do your research? I know you were um, uh, in your previous career, you were there, so you were immersed in the archives, but how do you go about finding all this information for your presentations?
So with the programs that I do, all of them are based on some sort of history that was in the park that I worked in, but I didn't get in depth until after we moved to Maryland. So I do a lot of the Library of Congress has wonderful resources, the National Archives, and each year more and more things are getting digitized. I just saw a blimp video that happened at Fort Hancock that would have never been available before. So many more things are being released to the public and available online. But just there's some wonderful books. I'm a collector of old books, so I read a lot of. There's a whole Army history of the Women's Army Corps. That was a wonderful book, and about officers' wives and all these things. But there's so many more resources available online now that are through reputable sources.
Great. I know you kind of mentioned that, but can you elaborate a little bit more about the nurses?
So they served stateside, they served overseas. Most of them were lieutenants. I believe the supervisors were captains, and it wasn't until after the war that they were given full ranks and benefits of the military that even the Women's Army Corps was given, or the waves were given at the time. So the ones who served in the Philippines, it's a wonderful story about how even though they were taken over as POWs, they continued nursing and they continued taking care of them. They were doing wonderful things all over the world. Wherever the soldiers were, they were there.
Thank you. Does anyone else have any other questions or comments, Mary? And if it is easier for you, you can unmute yourself at this point if it's easier for you than typing it all out.
Thank you for having me here tonight. I really enjoy talking about this topic. It's such an interesting story on how women went from staying at home to being members of the military or working in a factory. Nobody would have thought about such a thing before that.
One of the questions that came through is, did any women serve with the Army Corps of Engineers?
Well, I don't know specifically. They were in every part of the Army. So if there was a need for different type of clerical positions, they were there. There's the different, the military has different service occupations, And I think there were like 400 of them in World War II, and women served in about 200 of them. So most likely, if um, if there was a need within the Army Corps of Engineers or anything else, they would have served there.
Thank you. Is the building behind you in the background still standing?
It is. It has actually been renovated, and you can rent it out for your wedding.
Thank you. So I guess with all of the information that's still coming out, do you go back in and change your presentations to include more information?
Like with those videos, I do go back and periodically check to find if there's a better video, or because they do change. Like I do one on women, I do a Christmas in World War II presentation, and I keep finding better videos. So I will change around different videos to if I find a better one that's come. The British Path is a really wonderful website, and they have great videos of World War II especially. And they do have good ones on lighthouses too.
Great, thank you. All right, so I don't see anything else coming through in the chat, so I want to thank you all for attending. I will send out a link to this recording and any of the resources that you would like to share with us, like the articles you mentioned and your website. If you want me to include those in the thing I send out, just let me know. I'll send them over, and I'll make sure that everyone who attends this presentation gets those things. And again, I would love to have you back in the future to talk about the lighthouses. And thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me.
Good.